the 17th of January 1943, Warsaw, Poland, 11:47 p.m. The snow fell in silence over the cobblestones of Żelazna Street, each flake a whisper against the blackout curtains that hung like shrouds over the darkened windows. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp wool, of frost clinging to iron railings, and beneath it all faint, sour, unmistakable the scent of fear. In the Jewish ghetto, where 500,000 souls had been compressed into less than 2 square miles, fear had its own odour. It clung to the peeling plaster walls, to the stairwells where families huddled 6 to a room, to the frozen breath of mothers who no longer sang lullabies, because silence was the only currency that still held value. She stood at the checkpoint, 29 years old, wearing a nurse's armband with the Star of Life emblem clearly visible. Her name was Irena Sendler, though to the children she would come to carry out of hell, she was simply Jolanta, one of many false identities she wore like armour against the machinery of extermination. In her handbag, tucked beneath rolls of bandages and bottles of antiseptic, lay forged documents, each one a ticket to survival, each one punishable by immediate execution. Her breath formed small clouds in the freezing air. She did not tremble, not visibly, not where the SS could see. 3 officers stood at the gate, their Feldgrau uniforms pressed sharp despite the cold, their MP-40 submachine guns hanging loose from leather straps. They were young 22, perhaps 23 old enough to kill, young enough to believe they were building a new world. The tallest one, an Oberscharführer with a dueling scar traced along his left cheek, looked at her papers with the bored precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times. Behind him, the ghetto wall rose 12 feet high, topped with broken glass and barbed wire that caught the moonlight like frozen lightning. She smiled. Not a broad smile. Not defiance. Just the faint upward curve of lips that suggested she had nothing to hide, that she was merely a nurse doing her rounds, that the rumble of trucks beyond the wall trucks bound for Treblinka meant nothing to her at all. The Oberscharführer glanced up from her documents. Their eyes met. His were blue, cold as Baltic ice. Hers were steady. In that moment, suspended between detection and passage, between life and the machinery of death, the entire architecture of Nazi ideology hung in balance. She was a Polish woman, a social worker, a non-Jew who could have turned away and could have chosen the safety of indifference. Instead, she smiled. He waved her through. To understand what Irena Sendler did in the winter of 1943, one must first understand what Warsaw had become. The city that had once been the heart of Polish Jewish culture, home to synagogues and theatres, to scholars and merchants, to a community that traced its roots back 6 centuries, had been transformed into a vast prison. On the 16th of October 1940, German Governor-General Hans Frank issued the decree that established the Warsaw Ghetto. By November, the walls were complete. By March 1941, over 400,000 Jews were sealed inside an area of 1.3 square miles. The mathematics of suffering were precise. Each apartment, designed for a single family, now housed an average of 7. Each room contained 13 people. Typhus spread like wildfire through the overcrowded tenements. Starvation became the governing principle of existence. The official German ration for Jews in the ghetto was 184 calories per day. For comparison, a sedentary adult requires approximately 1,800 calories to maintain basic metabolic function. The policy was not neglect, it was design. Death by attrition, death by mathematics. By the summer of 1941, 5,000 Jews were dying each month from starvation and disease. Their bodies were collected each morning, stacked like cordwood on wooden carts, wheeled to mass graves at the Jewish cemetery. Children with swollen bellies and stick-thin limbs begged at street corners, their eyes enormous in faces that had already begun to resemble skulls. The living envied the dead. And yet, even in this inferno of systematic cruelty, resistance took root. not always in the form of bullets and bombs, though those would come later during the ghetto uprising of April 1943. Resistance also lived in the quiet actions of those who refused to accept that certain lives were disposable. Irena Sendler was one such person. Born in 1,910 inches, Otwock, a small town near Warsaw, she had been raised by a father who practiced medicine among the poor, treating Jewish patients without regard for their ability to pay. When typhus swept through the community in 1917, her father contracted the disease while caring for Jewish families whom other doctors refused to treat. He died when Irena was 7 years old. His last words to her, as she would later recall, were simple. "If you see someone drowning, you must try to rescue them, even if you cannot swim." By 1942, Irena Sendler worked for the Social Welfare Department of the Warsaw municipality. Her position granted her a pass to enter the ghetto legally, ostensibly to inspect sanitary conditions and prevent the spread of typhus to the Aryan side of the city. The Germans, terrified of disease, permitted these inspections. They did not know, or perhaps did not care to look closely, that Irena and a network of conspirators had transformed their official duties into something else entirely. They were not merely inspecting, they were smuggling life itself out of the jaws of death. The children were the hardest to save because they were the most vulnerable to detection. An adult could sometimes pass as a Gentile worker if their features were not too distinctly Semitic, if their forged papers were convincing enough, if they kept their mouths shut and their eyes down. But children whispered in Yiddish when they dreamed, cried out for mothers in accents that would betray them instantly, carried mannerisms and memories that no forged baptismal certificate could erase. And children, the Nazis understood, were the future. To eradicate a people, one must first eradicate their children. The statistics of extermination were compiled with meticulous German efficiency. At Treblinka, the death camp located 60 miles northeast of Warsaw, approximately 900,000 Jews were murdered between July 1942 and October 1943. Of these, an estimated 200,000 were children. The process was industrial in its precision. Trains arrived at the platform. Families were separated. Children were herded toward buildings disguised as bathhouses. The doors were sealed. Diesel engines pumped carbon monoxide into the chambers. Death occurred within 20 to 30 minutes. The bodies were removed, gold teeth extracted, corpses burned in open pits or massive ovens. The entire process, from arrival to cremation, took less than 2 hours. This was the fate awaiting the children of the Warsaw Ghetto. Irena Sendler understood this with absolute clarity. She had seen the deportation notices, had watched the boxcars being loaded at the Umschlagplatz, the collection point where families were sorted like cattle. She had witnessed mothers pressing wedding rings and photographs into the hands of strangers, begging them to remember their names, to remember their children existed. And so she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would steal children from death. The methods were various, each one adapted to circumstance, each one requiring split-second timing and nerves of steel. Sometimes children were sedated with small doses of medication and hidden in ambulances beneath stretchers carrying corpses. The Germans rarely inspected dead bodies. Sometimes they were concealed in potato sacks, in toolboxes, in the secret compartments of trucks bringing supplies into the ghetto. Infants were smuggled out in suitcases, drugged just enough to keep them silent as they passed through checkpoints. Older children walked out through the sewers, led by guides who navigated the filth and darkness beneath the city streets, emerging blocks away on the Aryan side, blinking in sunlight that felt like a foreign country. But on the night of the 17th of January 1943, Irena Sendler orchestrated something unprecedented in scale and audacity. 89 children in a single operation. The plan had been weeks in the making, coordinated with the precision of a military operation. Irena had cultivated relationships with every checkpoint guard, learning their schedules, their weaknesses, their patterns. She knew which ones could be bribed with vodka or cigarettes, which ones looked the other way out of boredom or buried conscience, which ones had to be avoided entirely because their cruelty left no room for mercy. She had arranged safe houses throughout Warsaw convents, orphanages, private homes belonging to Polish families who risked execution to shelter Jewish children. Each location had been vetted. Each contact confirmed through multiple channels. The ghetto resistance network, the Council to Aid Jews, had provided forged documents, baptismal certificates, identity cards, ration books. Each child would need a new name, a new history, a new face to present to the world. The children themselves had to be prepared. Irina and her colleagues, Irina Schultz, Jadwiga Denica, Jaga Piotrowska, and dozens of others whose names history has only partially preserved, moved through the ghetto in the days before the operation, meeting with families in secret, explaining what would happen. Parents were asked to make an impossible choice: send their child away with strangers into an uncertain future, or keep them close and wait for the inevitable deportation to Treblinka. Some parents refused. They could not bear to part with their children, could not imagine a world where separation was preferable to remaining together, even if together meant death. Others understood. They dressed their children in their best remaining clothes, whispered instructions about how to behave, told them to forget their Jewish names, to forget Yiddish, to forget everything except survival. Mothers cut locks of hair and sewed them into coat linings. Fathers recited prayers over sons who would never have bar mitzvahs. The grief was oceanic, soundless, total. On the night of January 17, the temperature dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold was an ally. It kept German patrols indoors, reduced foot traffic, made people hurry rather than linger and observe. Irina had arranged for several trucks to be positioned at different points around the ghetto perimeter. One vehicle belonged to the gas supply company, driven by a sympathetic Pole who had been smuggling Jews for months. Another was an ambulance from the Epidemic Control Department, its Red Cross emblem granting it special passage privileges. A third was a delivery truck ostensibly carrying supplies to the quarantine ward, though its cargo bed had been fitted with false panels and padded compartments. The operation began at 11:30 p.m. Children were collected from predetermined locations: a bakery cellar on Gensia Street, an attic on Muranovska, a basement on Karmelika where 16 people lived in a space no larger than a prison cell. They were brought in small groups to staging areas near the wall, kept calm by whispered reassurances and the steady presence of women like Irina, who had spent weeks building trust, becoming familiar faces in a world where strangers meant danger. Some children cried, others were silent, shock having stripped them of language. The youngest was 4 months old, sedated and wrapped in blankets, handed from mother to courier like a sacred relic. The oldest was 15, a boy named David who had already lost his parents and 3 siblings to typhus. He carried a small knife and had to be convinced not to bring it, told that weapons would endanger everyone. Irina herself took the first group 23 children loaded into the gas supply truck. They were arranged in the cargo area, covered with tarpaulins and coal sacks, instructed to remain absolutely silent. Even the smallest sound could mean discovery, and discovery meant immediate execution, not just for the children, but for everyone involved. The truck rumbled through empty streets toward the checkpoint at Chłodna Street, where a wooden footbridge connected the large and small ghettos. This was the most dangerous moment. The guards here were SS, not regular Wehrmacht soldiers. They were ideologically committed, less susceptible to bribery, trained to be suspicious. Irina sat in the passenger seat, documents ready, her face composed. The driver, a man named Jan, who had been a tram operator before the war, gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. His hands shook slightly. Irina placed her own hand over his briefly steady, warm, human contact in a world that had forgotten humanity. The truck slowed. Flashlights swept across the windshield. Voices barked commands in German. The engine idled, coughing diesel smoke into the frozen air. 3 SS officers approached. One circled the truck, tapping the side panels with a rifle butt. In the cargo bed, 23 children held their breath. A baby began to whimper. The sedative was wearing off. Its mother, hidden among the children, pressed her hand gently over the infant's mouth, not to suffocate, just to muffle. The officer outside paused, tilted his head, listening. Irina stepped out of the cab. She did this deliberately, drawing attention to herself, away from the cargo. She smiled that same controlled, neutral smile and spoke in fluent German, commenting on the cold, mentioning that they were transporting emergency supplies to the quarantine ward, showing her medical authorization papers. Her German was perfect, her accent suggesting education, refinement. The SS officers were young men from rural Bavaria and Prussia, many of them barely literate. Authority, when spoken in the right tone, was its own credential. The officer who had been tapping the truck panels looked at her. His face was hard, angular, the face of a man who had learned to see Jews as vermin to be exterminated. But Irina was not Jewish. She wore no armband. Her papers identified her as a Catholic Pole, a medical professional, someone useful to the occupation regime. He glanced at her documents, then at her face, then back at the truck. For 5 seconds, an eternity compressed into heartbeats, he considered ordering a full inspection. Then he waved them through. The German soldiers who enforced the ghetto's perimeter were part of a vast machinery of genocide. But they were also individuals, young men conscripted into service, indoctrinated by years of Nazi propaganda that taught them Jews were subhuman parasites, responsible for Germany's defeat in the First World War, for economic hardship, for moral decay. They had been shown films like The Eternal Jew, which compared Jewish people to rats spreading disease. They had attended rallies where Hitler's voice thundered about racial purity and living space. They had been trained to see cruelty not as a moral failing, but as a necessary tool in the preservation of the Aryan race. And yet, even within this framework of systematic dehumanization, inconsistencies emerged. Some guards enforced regulations with fanatical zeal, beating children who begged for food, shooting anyone who approached the wall. Others looked away when bribes were offered, accepted cigarettes in exchange for safe passage, allowed themselves brief moments of selective blindness. These were not acts of heroism. Many of these same men participated in mass executions, deportations, atrocities beyond comprehension. But they demonstrated that even within the most totalitarian system, individual choice persisted. The machine required human operators, and humans, no matter how thoroughly indoctrinated, retained the capacity for inconsistency. Irina Sendler understood this. She cultivated these inconsistencies, exploited every crack in the facade. She learned the names of guards' children, asked about their families, treated them as human beings, even when their actions were monstrous. This was not moral compromise, it was strategic survival. Every life saved required manipulation of the system, a careful dance between compliance and subversion. She wore the symbols of authority, the nurse's armband, the medical credentials, while undermining the very structure those symbols represented. The 89 children smuggled out on the 17th of January 1943 represented only a fraction of Irina's total operation. By the time the Warsaw ghetto was liquidated in May 1943, following the desperate armed uprising that saw Jewish resistance fighters hold off German forces for nearly a month, Irina Sendler and her network had rescued approximately 2,500 children. Each name was recorded on thin tissue paper, placed in glass jars, and buried in a neighbor's garden. The lists contained both the child's original Jewish name and their new Polish identity. Irina intended, after the war, to reunite children with surviving family members. She believed, with stubborn optimism, that families would survive. Most did not. Of the 2,500 children Irina saved, fewer than 1,000 ever found surviving relatives. The others grew up as Poles, often unaware of their Jewish heritage, raised in Catholic orphanages or by foster families who had been sworn to secrecy. Some eventually learned the truth of their origins. Others died never knowing, The jars containing their names were dug up in 1945, the tissue paper carefully preserved despite years in damp soil. The lists became a testament proof that these children had existed, had been loved, had been worth saving, even when the world insisted otherwise. But on that January night, the future was unknowable. Irena made 4 more trips before dawn, each time collecting children from different locations, each time passing through checkpoints, where discovery would have meant immediate execution. The gas supply truck driver made 3 runs. The ambulance driver made 2. Other couriers moved children through the sewers, emerging in safe houses on the Aryan side of the city. By 5 a.m., as the first grey light touched the ghetto walls, 89 children had been removed from the path of annihilation. Not all made it through the night unscathed. One boy, aged 9, panicked in the sewer tunnel and had to be carried unconscious the final 100 yards. A girl of 6 was nearly discovered at a checkpoint when she began reciting the Shema Yisrael, the central Jewish prayer, in her sleep. Her courier, a woman named Maria, pinched her hard enough to wake her, then claimed the child was delirious with fever. 2 infants died during transport, the sedatives administered too heavily, their small bodies unable to metabolize the medication. Their deaths were mourned in silence, their names added to lists that would never be complete, their loss a reminder that even the most carefully planned resistance against genocide could not save everyone. Irena herself was arrested on the 20th of October, 1943. The Gestapo had been watching her, documenting her movements, compiling evidence of her work with the resistance. They came for her at dawn, dragging her from her apartment while neighbors watched through curtained windows. She was taken to Pawiak prison, where political prisoners and resistance fighters were held before execution. For 3 months, she was interrogated and tortured. Her legs and feet were beaten with iron bars until the bones shattered. Her interrogators demanded names of children, names of couriers, names of safe houses. She gave them nothing, not a single name, not a single location. Each day she was beaten. Each night she endured. The jars containing the lists of children remained buried in the garden, undiscovered. In January 1944, Irena was sentenced to death by firing squad. Her execution was scheduled for January 20, but the Ghetto Resistance Network, the same organization that had supported her rescue operations, pooled their resources and bribed a German guard. On the morning of her scheduled execution, Irena's name appeared on the official list of those who had already been shot. She was smuggled out of the prison, unconscious from her injuries, and hidden in a safe house, where she remained for the rest of the war, her legs permanently damaged, her body broken, but her silence intact. The Germans who occupied Poland expected compliance. They had conquered the country in 35 days, their blitzkrieg tactics overwhelming Polish defences with a combination of armour, air power, and speed that redefined modern warfare. They believed their victory was proof of Aryan superiority, evidence that Slavic peoples were racially inferior and destined for subjugation. They expected Poles to accept their new status labourers in a greater German Reich, useful as agricultural workers and factory hands, disposable when their utility expired. What they encountered instead was resistance woven into the fabric of daily life. Not just the armed resistance of the Home Army, which conducted sabotage operations and intelligence gathering, but the quiet resistance of ordinary people who hid Jews in attics and cellars, who forged documents, who smuggled food into ghettos, who chose solidarity over self-preservation. This resistance was not motivated by military strategy or political ideology alone. It was rooted in something deeper, a fundamental rejection of the premise that some human lives were worth less than others. Irena Sendler's actions were extraordinary, but she was not alone. Across occupied Europe, thousands of individuals made similar choices. In France, entire villages hid Jewish children. In Denmark, fishermen smuggled nearly the entire Jewish population to Sweden. In the Netherlands, families built secret rooms behind bookcases and beneath floorboards. In Greece, Orthodox priests issued false baptismal certificates. These acts of rescue were not coordinated by a central authority. They emerged spontaneously, organically, from a moral consensus that transcended nationality, religion, and political affiliation. They represented a form of resistance that the Nazis, despite their military might and bureaucratic efficiency, could never fully suppress. The contrast between expectation and reality haunted the occupiers. German reports from Poland frequently complained about the difficulty of securing Polish cooperation in the extermination of Jews. While collaboration certainly occurred, some Poles betrayed Jews to the Gestapo for money or favors the scale of rescue efforts frustrated German objectives. In Warsaw alone, an estimated 28,000 Jews survived the war by hiding on the Aryan side of the city, sheltered by Polish families and resistance networks. Each survivor represented a failure of Nazi ideology, a crack in the edifice of racial theory that claimed Slavs were inherently anti-Semitic and would eagerly participate in genocide. Irina Sendler saved 2,500 children, not because she possessed superhuman courage, but because she understood a simple truth, that ideology, no matter how totalitarian, could not erase the human capacity for compassion. The SS officers at the checkpoints were men trained to be monsters, but they remained men capable of inconsistency, susceptible to manipulation, vulnerable to the ordinary human reluctance to look too closely at what was hidden in a truck bed or beneath a tarpaulin. Every time a guard waved her through, every time a bribe was accepted or a blind eye turned, the absolute authority of Nazi racial ideology cracked a little further. The symbolic object that recurs throughout Irina Sendler's story is not food or weaponry, but paper-thin, fragile, ordinary paper that became the instrument of salvation. The forged documents she carried, the baptismal certificates and identity cards that transformed Jewish children into Catholic Poles, were paper. The lists she compiled, recording each child's true name and new identity, were written on tissue paper, thin enough to roll into tubes and fit inside narrow jars. The death sentence issued against her was printed on official paper bearing the eagle and swastika of the Third Reich, and the notification of her execution, the forged document that saved her life, was also paper. Paper, in Nazi Germany, was power. The regime ran on documentation, identification cards, travel permits, ration books, genealogical records, proving Aryan ancestry. The bureaucracy of genocide required meticulous record-keeping. Trains to Treblinka ran on schedules typed on paper. Death certificates were issued for murdered Jews. Property seizures were documented on forms. The entire apparatus of the Holocaust was a paper machine, processing human beings through a system that reduced them to entries in ledgers and statistics in reports. Irina Sendler turned that paper machine against itself. She forged the documents that the system demanded, creating false identities that allowed children to slip through the cracks. She kept her own meticulous records, preserving the truth that the Nazis sought to erase the names, the families, the existence of children who were supposed to disappear without trace. Her paper was an act of resistance, a refusal to allow history to be written solely by the victors. The jars buried in the garden were time capsules, messages to the future that said, "These children lived, they mattered, they had names." When the jars were dug up in 1945, some of the tissue paper had degraded, ink blurred by moisture, names partially illegible. But enough survived. Enough to prove that Irina Sendler had not merely saved lives, she had saved identity itself, the irreducible fact of personhood that the Nazis sought to extinguish. In a regime that treated human beings as insects to be catalogued and exterminated, she treated them as sacred, worth documenting, worth remembering. The war ended in May 1945. The Third Reich collapsed, its leaders dead or captured, its cities reduced to rubble. The final solution, which had murdered 6 million Jews, was revealed in its full horror as Allied forces liberated the concentration camps. Photographs of skeletal survivors and mounds of corpses shocked the world. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi war criminals for crimes against humanity, a legal concept that had to be invented because existing law had no framework for processing genocide. Irina Sendler lived. Her legs never fully healed, she walked with crutches for the rest of her life, her bones improperly set, a permanent reminder of the iron bars that shattered them in Pauiak prison. But she lived. She retrieved the jars from her neighbor's garden and began the heartbreaking work of trying to reunite children with surviving family members. Most of the parents were dead, murdered at Treblinka or Auschwitz or Majdanek. The children, now scattered across Poland and Europe, had new names, new lives, new memories. Some wanted to know their original identities. Others preferred to forget, the trauma of their early childhoods too painful to revisit. After the war, Irena Sendler returned to social work. She did not seek recognition for her wartime activities. In communist Poland, which suppressed discussion of wartime resistance not controlled by the Communist Party, her story remained largely unknown. The Ghetto network, which had been supported by the Polish government in exile in London, was politically inconvenient for the new Soviet-aligned regime. Irena lived quietly, working with orphanages and adoption agencies, continuing the work of caring for children in a country that had lost a generation to war. It was not until 1965 that Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority, recognized her as righteous among the nations, a title given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. Even then, the communist government prevented her from traveling to Jerusalem to receive the honor. She remained in Warsaw, her story known to a small circle of survivors and historians, but absent from official narratives of the war. In the 1,990 seconds after the fall of communism, Irena Sendler's story began to reach wider audiences. A group of Kansas high school students researched her life and wrote a play titled Life in a Jar, which was performed internationally. Journalists and historians sought her out. Documentaries were filmed. In 2003, Pope John Paul II, himself a Pole who had lived through the Nazi occupation, sent her a personal letter of commendation. In 2007, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, though she did not win. When reporters asked her about the nomination, she expressed bemusement, insisting she was not a hero, that she had simply done what any decent person would do. She died on the 12th of May 2008 at the age of 98. Her funeral in Warsaw was attended by survivors she had saved, now elderly themselves, and by their children and grandchildren, generations that existed because a young woman had smiled at an SS officer and smuggled 89 children out of the ghetto in a single night. To understand the magnitude of what Irena Sendler accomplished, one must consider the counterfactual what would have happened to those 2,500 children if she had not acted. Based on the deportation records from the Warsaw Ghetto, the overwhelming majority would have been transported to Treblinka and murdered within hours of arrival. Their bodies would have been burned. Their names would have been lost. They would have become part of the anonymous millions, reduced to statistics in the final accounting of the Holocaust. Instead, they lived. They grew up, married, had children of their own. The descendants of those 2,500 children now number in the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands. An entire lineage of humanity that exists because one woman refused to accept that certain lives were disposable. This is the calculus of resistance. That individual action, even when it seems insignificant against the machinery of totalitarianism, ripples forward through time, creating futures that would otherwise have been erased. The Germans expected compliance. They expected the Poles to betray their Jewish neighbors, to collaborate in the extermination process, to accept the racial hierarchy that placed Aryans at the top and Jews at the bottom. They encountered instead people like Irena Sendler, ordinary people who became extraordinary not through superhuman courage, but through the simple refusal to look away. This was the great miscalculation of Nazi ideology, the belief that propaganda and terror could erase the fundamental human capacity for empathy. Every time a child was smuggled out of the ghetto, every time a guard accepted a bribe and looked away, every time a Polish family opened their door to a stranger carrying a Jewish infant, the absolute authority of the Nazi worldview fractured a little more. The regime could murder millions, it did murder millions, but it could not kill the idea that each life was irreplaceable, that each child mattered, that humanity was not a commodity to be sorted by race and discarded when inconvenient. The epilogue to Irena Sendler's story is written not in monuments or medals, but in the living. Among the children she saved was a girl named Elżbieta Fikowska, smuggled out of the ghetto as a 6-month-old infant hidden in a carpenter's toolbox. Her mother, murdered at Treblinka, never saw her daughter grow up, but Elżbieta lived. She became a painter, an artist who documented her memories of the war in images of childhood interrupted. She met Irena Sendler in the 1,990 seconds, held the hand of the woman who had saved her life, looked into her eyes and said, "Thank you." 2 words inadequate to the task, but sufficient to convey what transcends language, the debt that can never be repaid, the gratitude that spans lifetimes. Another survivor, a man named Piotr Zettinger, learned as an adult that his Catholic identity was a fabrication, that his real name was Moshe Ackerman, that the parents who raised him were not his biological family. The revelation shattered his sense of self, forced him to reconstruct his identity at 40 years old. He struggled with anger, with loss, with the questions that have no answers. But he also came to understand that the lie that raised him was a gift, the gift of life itself, purchased at tremendous cost by people he would never meet. These are the stories that do not fit easily into the heroic narratives of war. They are complicated, painful, marked by loss and ambiguity. The children Irena saved were traumatized by their experiences, their childhoods fractured by separation, hiding, and the knowledge of horrors no child should witness. Many struggled with identity, with survivor's guilt, with the question of why they lived when so many others died. But they lived, and in living, they became the refutation of genocide, proof that the machinery of extermination could be resisted, that life could be stolen back from the jaws of death, that the human spirit could endure even the most systematic cruelty. The jars buried in the garden, the tissue paper marked with names, the forged documents, and the lists, these were not just records. They were promises made by Irena Sendler and her network to the dead and the living. That memory would survive, that names would not be erased, that the truth of what happened would be preserved. In the face of an ideology that sought to render an entire people invisible, she inscribed their existence in ink and hid it in the earth, trusting that the future would dig it up and remember. The 17th of January 1943, Warsaw, Poland, 11:47 p.m. The snow falling over Żelazna Street, the checkpoint guards with their bored cruelty, the young woman in a nurse's armband who smiled and carried death's children toward life. This moment contains within it the essential truth of resistance under totalitarianism, that systems, no matter how absolute, are operated by individuals, and individuals retain the capacity for inconsistency, for mercy, for the small betrayals of ideology that accumulate into survival. Irena Sendler smiled at SS officers and saved 89 children in one night, not because she was superhuman, but because she was deeply, stubbornly human. She understood that the Nazis' greatest weapon was not their military force, but their ability to make ordinary people believe that resistance was futile, that individual action could not matter against the machinery of the state. She proved them wrong. Every child smuggled out of the ghetto, every forged document, every name written on tissue paper and buried in a jar, these were refutations of the ideology of disposability. The Germans expected to find a conquered people. They found instead Irena Sendler and thousands like her, who demonstrated that the human capacity for compassion could not be conquered, that solidarity was stronger than terror, that the simple act of seeing another person as fully human could become, in the context of genocide, a revolutionary act. The jars are empty now, the tissue paper preserved in archives, the children who survived now elderly or dead themselves. But the ripples continue. Every descendant of those 2,500 children is a living testament to the power of individual resistance. Every person who hears Irena Sendler's story and decides to act with courage in their own context is part of that legacy. The machinery of hatred still exists in the world. It takes new forms, targets different victims, operates with new technologies. But so does resistance. So does the stubborn human insistence that every life is irreplaceable, that no one is disposable, that when we see someone drowning, we must try to rescue them, even if we cannot swim. Irina Sendler stood at a checkpoint in the winter of 1943, surrounded by SS officers and the smell of death, and she smiled. Not out of joy, but out of defiance. Not because she was unafraid, but because she refused to let fear dictate her actions. She smiled and carried children toward life, one by one, night after night, until the ghetto burned and the war ended and the world moved on. And in that smile, in that refusal to accept the unacceptable, lies a truth that transcends history. That freedom is not granted by governments or won by armies alone, but sustained by ordinary people who choose, in moments of darkness, to carry light. The snow has long since melted from the cobblestones of Żelazna Street. The ghetto walls have been demolished. The checkpoint where she stood no longer exists. But the children she saved lived, and their children lived, and their children's children, an ever-expanding constellation of lives that affirm the fundamental truth she knew and proved. That one person, armed with nothing but courage and compassion, can change the world. Not all of it, not forever, but enough to matter. Enough that when the accounting of history is made, and the crimes are tallied and the victims mourned, there will also be this: 89 children in a single night, 2,500 children across a war, and one woman who looked into the abyss and refused to let it win. That is the legacy of Irina Sendler. That is the truth she buried in jars and carried in her heart until the day she died. That when the world descends into darkness, there will always be those who smuggle light. There will always be those who smile at monsters and steal children from death. There will always be those who choose, despite everything, to be human.